So let's talk a little bit about how you would compensate leaders. And there's no question when you, as I said in my earlier talk, that when you go to the hospital administration, what distinguishes your group from all the rest is the quality of your leadership and your management. Residency training at one point in my career was a real differentiator in terms of which groups could vie for the contract and which couldn't, because there weren't that many residency trained people around. I was in the first group to take the boards, and then I was a board examiner for 7 years, but I wasn't residency trained. So a lot of us were in that category initially. They are assumed when you go to make a bid for a contract that everybody's board certified. Now I'm from Texas, and I have a sailboat on one of the lakes north of Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and when I leave home to drive to the dock for the sailboat, I pass 5 freestanding emergency departments. So our manpower issue in Texas is critical because we've moved so many emergency physicians into these freestanding centers. As you know, Texas is one of only 2, Colorado I think being the other one, that has legitimized physician-owned freestanding centers. Hospitals can own them any place, and they're treated exactly like a hospital one is treated, but Texas has legitimized them to where the insurance companies are required to pay the 992 code series for visits there, as well as a facility fee in many cases. As the manpower shortage gets worse, that could come to be a differentiator once again. But it's the quality of the leadership that determines the future of the contract. So how do you figure out how to pay somebody? And I've been part of small groups, larger groups, mid-sized groups, eventually a huge group, and you have to bring some order to it, otherwise it just becomes totally subjective, which doesn't work for anybody. We looked at the hassle factor. The example being the medical director. What is it worth to be the go-to guy 24/7 for an emergency department for both the docs and the outcome of care in the department? There's probably not enough money to compensate that person. What I always said is you need to look for the guy who just has to drive the bus. There are some people who are fine sitting in the back looking out the window, but there are other people who just got to drive the bus. And those are the people you want in this job because they'll do it even though they're not fully compensated for it. You're all taking the phone calls and handling problems at home because you just have to drive the bus. I'm glad you're here. You're in good company. So you might rank, we'll talk a minute about ranking hassle factor. Time is the other, actual time spent in doing the job. I would caution you like Reagan, trust but verify. So if it's attendance at a hospital committee meeting, the individual should present the attendance record that he was there. And you should bear in mind that this is time he's giving up away, or him or her, or giving up away from clinical practice. And then the third element of pay or value, if you will, is targeted results. And these are really developed by larger groups than a single hospital group generally, but every group should do it. There are certain things in your group that you want to accomplish in a priority. And unless you make someone individually accountable for that to happen, the chances are it won't happen. Shared accountability never works because what happens when it doesn't happen? The other guy's fault. So it's got to be one-on-one. So you want predetermined targeted events that you want that leader to accomplish. So when it comes to the hassle factor, you look at the complexity of the position and the talents it takes to be successful and the consequences of failing to perform. Look, here's 3 positions. Let's say we created a scale from 1 to 10, and we said each point was worth $500 a month. Who would you rank in that group as the lowest on that scale? I'd say the director of QA. He goes to a meeting or two and does a little chart review, and I wouldn't put that very high on the hassle list myself. The group president, he has to interface with hospital administration, and you deserve more money for that for sure. And the medical director is the 24/7 guy. So you can develop a scale, use your own 4 to 5% benchmark that we talked about this morning, and back into how much money you've got to spend on administration in your practice, and allocate it according to these 3 criteria, one being hassle factor, that you really need to make up individually in your own group. I can't give you a canned answer to that one. But the medical director is the ultimate guy. If whatever your scale is, he's the 10. He's on the 10 end. For each leadership role, you have to keep a log of time spent and what was done in that time. If the hospital is paying any portion of the medical director's salary, the hospital has to have this for its Medicare compliance, and your group needs to have it for accountability. If you're on productivity-based compensation, the medical director is likely going to need some special consideration. Why? How does that job get done? A lot of that job. Dr. X wanders through the ED and says, "Oh, Ron is on duty today. I'll pull him aside and we'll answer a few questions." So if the regular guy gets 10 interruptions an hour, the medical director must get double that number. So oftentimes the medical director, his productivity is lower than everybody else's for good reason. The other thing is the medical director really needs to work more weekday hours because he needs to be visible during those times and work fewer nights and weekends. That's an unpleasant reality for especially Democratic groups who like to see everybody be equal. But the truth is that the medical director needs to be there when other people are looking for him to solve problems, or her. So you've got to make some special provision for that. And what a lot of groups do is they simply assign the average productivity per hour number to his or her hours, that individual. And that may or not be exactly right, but it's a good approximation. Now, the biggest question, how much do you pay per hour for clinical time relative to administrative time? How many believe you should pay less for administrative time than for clinical time? All of you have seen my slide, right? How many believe it should be parity? How many believe it should be more? All right, okay, me too, but I've never been able to make it happen. I can't convince the hospital and I can't convince my partners. So the truth is that you do need to pay, I think, at parity, and we'll talk about why. This is I'm still involved in the Directors Academy, managing phase 4, which is the project phase, the last phase of the program. And these are very loose rules that have kind of come out of phase 1 of the ED Directors Academy. We've now had more than 2,000 physicians go through that academy at about 100 physicians a class. And I would look at these as very loose approximations of how much time it takes. It varies depending upon, is the medical director managing his own patient complaints, or is he turfing those off to the nursing staff? Is he delegating attendance at some meetings to other physicians in the group, or is he doing it all himself? But I know that at 50,000 and above, most emergency department medical director jobs are an FTE. So the other thing I know is that doctors, and Mr. Dye alluded to this as well, don't maintain their credibility if they stop practicing. So what most groups look at is a medical director who works maybe a third clinical and 2/3 administrative, and an assistant medical director who works the opposite, so that together they constitute an FTE. Also depends on how your group is structured and how much help you're getting from the other partners as to how much time needs to be involved. So I think rates ought to be the same, and these are the reasons. that effective leaders have many uncompensated hours, and you're sitting in some of them, to develop their skill set that are not compensated. And it literally takes a career to be an effective manager. Effective leaders have 2 sets of credentials, 2 sets of information flow to stay with, rather than just one, just the clinical. Doctors, as a rule, make terrible managers. And you have to ask yourself, how can somebody in the top 1% of the intelligence quotient make a terrible manager? And the reason they do is that they do it part-time. And they do it, and they kind of dip in and dip out. You can't be an effective manager doing that. And you can't be an effective manager, Steve.
So I want to push right back at you on this.
Okay.
You just said to the group that if you're going to be an effective leader, you have to continue to work clinically. And here you are saying you can't, you're not going to be good at it because you're not doing it.
I'm drawing a distinction between managers and leaders. Physicians make great leaders, and leadership can be done on a part-time basis, but managerial things can't. And that's one of the disadvantages of a small group, is you end up having physicians do things that a non-physician could do cheaper and better. And a lot of that is what happens to the Democratic group, in that they put people in roles that they're really not competent to fill. So effective leadership determines the fate of the contract, and to me there's no reasonable rationale why that person should be paid less, although I hear that over and over and over again in groups, that it should be that way. The group's board of directors, or the group as a whole, if you're small enough, ought to have an annual meeting where you review, your mission, vision, value statement, and determine what are your priorities for the year to come. And then those priorities ought to dictate how you deal with your leadership. There are 2 types of goals: maintenance, which falls more in the management side, and then change management. And the basic unit of change management in any business is the project. So you need to educate all of your people in project participation and management skills. Because if you can't conduct projects, you can't answer questions definitively, and you can't move the group ahead. So in the groups I was involved in, we always spent money on communications development training and on project management training, because everybody needed to know that. And the goals, whatever goals you set, they've got to be objectively measurable. If there's any element of subjectivity in it, it won't work, because you'll get pushback from whoever the individual is. And so when you go to look for what that objectively measurable parameter is, what you'll find is that half the data you've got is no good. It's bad. The system doesn't collect the correct data. So oftentimes, this means re-engineering the system in order to get the reliable metric that you need. And there should be a compensation consequence. There is in every other field of business for the CEO. There's a compensation consequence for achieving or not achieving those goals and directives. Now, I've identified numerous projects where it would take 10% more of the medical director's time, and he could drop to the bottom line $100,000. And I've said, I think it would be reasonable to incentivize that and give him a $10,000 bonus if he could accomplish that. And you know what the group votes? No. So they're willing to forego $90,000 in their pocket just so the medical director doesn't get a bonus. Now, we've got to stop that kind of thinking as we get to be more and more like businesses, because it just doesn't work, and we don't accomplish what we've got to address all the change that confronts us. And absolutely, you need to conduct quarterly reviews. A lot of groups have partnership tracks where you tell a guy, you're going to be with us for a year, and then you'll be considered for partnership tracks. And what happens is they have a partner review in the 11th month and tell the guy that he's not cutting it. And you can imagine the lawsuits that flow from that. So it is one of the worst duties, I think, of a medical director to have to sit down with his colleagues and critique their performance. But it is critical for the success of your group to do it. And it keeps communications straight, addresses critical problems early, and keeps somebody from suing you, which is a good thing. The hospital should have input into whatever your goals are. Theoretically, you're playing in their sandbox. You should be accomplishing what they want to see accomplished. And so it's good, typically, to involve a C-suite person in your mission, vision, value exercise on an annual basis. For two reasons. One is they're the ones who are going to get you the money to accomplish whatever the task is. And the other is their input's valuable in terms of what goals you set for yourself. And if you're in one of these roles, you really need to develop two lists of duties: those that serve primarily the group's interest, and then those that serve primarily the hospital's interest. Hospitals are not excited about paying a medical director stipend, but most of them, when given the data, will ante up and do so. So they should be paying a portion of this medical director's cost, or any other position that is doing hospital work, and it's something that you should put into your negotiation bucket. You want regularly to report project status, so that if you're assigned a project, you should come to the monthly meeting ready to report how are things coming with that, where are you with that project, what's the status of it. That's designed really to enhance accountability, so that people know if they're going to have to report, it incentivizes them to get busy and do something. Okay, in a mature contract, 50% or more of the medical director's time is often spent on hospital functions and not related to the group. So it's important to recognize that. In my opinion, in the Democratic group, owners and partners should all be carrying as much of an equal load of administrative duties as possible, and they shouldn't be compensated. If you're getting an equal division of those shareholder dollars that I showed on the slide earlier, this is what you get it for. You get it for being an owner and showing ownership behavior. That's a foreign concept to a lot of Democratic groups, by the way. Don't pay a physician to do what a non-physician can do better and less expensively. And this is hard when you're small because you can't afford it. But there are small groups that learn to outsource these key things and actually get them accomplished much cheaper, particularly in the business back office services area. Don't create a paid administrative position without an objective way to gauge whether the results are forthcoming or not, and a commitment to do a performance review. I think that's critical, because what can happen is you can create a whole raft of administrative positions, each one dribbling out a few dollars a month. And so my last point is sunset everything. On an annual basis, take a look at it again. Say, do we really need that position? Do we really need that many hours? And reset the clock.